Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the Harlem Renaissance, Jazz, and Flappers, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. So you just started learning about the Roaring Twenties, and we call this time period Roaring to emphasize the rapid economic growth and the rapid social changes that were occurring in the US in this decade. And in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 trends of the 1920s that were new and different from what came before. We're going to start a little bit before the 1920s in the year 1917, and that was the year that America entered World War I. And because of the draft that began that year, there was a labor shortage in northern factories, and so companies began recruiting black men to leave the South and move to the North. And that led to the beginning of the Great Migration, the movement of millions of African Americans from the rural South to cities in the North and later in the West. The Great Migration was an important cause of a major event of the 1920s that I'm going to talk about now called the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City, and the Harlem Renaissance refers to a movement of African American artists and intellectuals centered in New York City that took place in the 1920s. Black artists collaborated with one another in cities like New York and Chicago and created an explosion of creative output. I mentioned before that the Great Migration was a cause of the Harlem Renaissance, and that's because as black people migrated to cities in the North, they found themselves living for the first time in close proximity to large numbers of other black people. The big city was a very favorable place for the sharing of ideas among artists. So without the Great Migration, black people might have continued to live more isolated lives from each other in the rural South and would not have been present in such large numbers in cities in the North. All right, now let's look at some of who the artists of the Harlem Renaissance were. All of the people that I'm about to tell you about took pride in being black and sought to create art that, instead of imitating white art forms, created a new, uniquely African American culture. The first artist is Langston Hughes, who was a poet. And you're going to read some of Langston Hughes' poetry in class. Next is Zora Neale Hurston, a writer who was also a friend and collaborator of Langston Hughes. Zora Neale Hurston wrote a very beautiful book called Their Eyes Were Watching God. I highly recommend it. Here is Aaron Douglas, a painter and printmaker. You can see in these works how Douglas included imagery that reflected both African and African American culture. And the last artist is Duke Ellington, a jazz musician who played the piano and conducted a band. Ellington wrote many jazz songs, including a famous one called Take the A Train. Maybe some of you ride the A train regularly. So Ellington was one of the most famous leaders of a new musical form called jazz. Jazz is a uniquely American form of music that is based on improvisation, and improvisation means creating something spontaneously without preparation. In other words, jazz musicians make up their music as they're playing. The song is different every time it's played. Jazz began in the South, but it developed a lot during the Harlem Renaissance because there were so many jazz clubs in northern cities, like the ones you see in these pictures, where musicians were able to share their talents. Improvisation makes jazz really, really different from the European forms of music that had been popular in America before this time. In most European music, a composer writes notes down and the performers play exactly what the composer wrote. But in jazz, musicians read chord changes that look like this, where each of these letters represents a group of possible notes that can be played. And the jazz performer gets to decide which of those notes to play at what time and how to play them. And that is called improvising. All right, now we're going to switch gears and talk about a final trend of the 1920s, And this one applied to white women. And these women were called flappers. Flappers were mostly young, white, middle-class women who, through their fashion and through their behavior, challenged traditional ideas about how women should act. Flappers promoted new ideas about what was acceptable for women. For example, they smoked cigarettes, they cut their hair short, and they wore clothing that revealed their arms and legs. Flappers were not the first women to do these things, but they were accepted by mainstream society in ways that their predecessors had not been. The passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which you learned about earlier this year, gives one explanation for the rise of flappers, and that's because gaining the right to vote inspired many white women to claim more independence in their daily lives. The right to smoke, the right to wear their hair short if they wanted. Flappers had a confidence inspired by their newly won voting rights. In this picture on the right, you see Clara Bow, a Hollywood celebrity, playing the role of a flapper in a 1920s film. Notice her short hair, her revealing clothes, and her confident attitude. Alright, now it's time to review the objectives. If you missed the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.